Hi everyone, I'm Liz and welcome back to Elizabeth Ann Can Stitch. Today's video is going to be all about making this project folder. I'm going to walk you through all the supplies that are needed to make this bag and all the steps to put the bag together. I also have written instructions in the description box below, along with a list of all the supplies, so feel free to reference that while you watch the video. Let's get started. Okay, so let's take a look at the supplies you'll need. You will need one fabric for the main outside and lining of your bag, at least a half yard of fabric. And then you will need an accent fabric for the inside pocket, and you can get away with about a fat quarter of fabric for that. And then you'll need about a fat quarter or a traditional quarter yard for binding and for accent trim on the inside of the bag. Then you're gonna need at least a 14-inch zipper, one magnetic snap. I like the By Annie magnetic snaps, but I'm sure there are other brands out there, but this is a sew-in magnetic snap. And then you're gonna need vinyl. I use the By Annie premium clear 16 gauge vinyl. So I would just recommend a high quality 16 gauge is really nice. There's probably some smaller gauges you can get away with like at Joann's or Michael's, but I really like this By Annie's vinyl. So this is the one I use. And then you will need some interfacing. I use Pellon SF101. It's a really nice light to medium weight fusible interfacing, and so we'll need a little bit of fusible interfacing. Okay, and then the last thing you'll need is some sort of foam stabilizer. So Soft and Stable I think is the most common one, and then there's also this Bosal brand. I really like the double-sided fusible Bosal, so that's what I'm going to use today. I find that really easy for basting and quilting through all the layers of the folder. So that is the last thing you need, and let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to start with my main fabric. So you can use a half yard, a regular half yard of fabric for this, or you could use 2 fat quarters. You could also piece together a really cool front for the bag. I mean, you can kind of customize this as much as you want, but for this tutorial, I am just going to use a simple half yard of fabric. I think this is actually a full yard of fabric, but I'll cut it down. The fabric I'm using today is Liberty of London, and it's Bohemian Bloom. So from my half yard of fabric, I'm actually going to cut this to a piece that is 14.5 inches wide. And then what I want to do is take the selvages off of the fabric. So I've got my 14.5 inch by 44-ish inch. And so I'm going to take the selvages off by just using my straight edge. And you really want to use this full length of fabric. So I'm trimming just up against the selvage. We really don't have a lot of room to spare because what we're doing is using the full 21 inches of width and like to kind of create the width of our bag, if that makes sense. So what we're cutting out is actually this piece of fabric here and the piece of fabric here that's on the inside of the bag. And so our bag can really only be as wide as our fabric in order to kind of maximize the best use of our fabric. So of course you can make this bag any size you want. It will just take more fabric than what I'm showing here. Okay, so you can see I don't want to cut at the fold because these two pieces are, it's folded a little off center. So I want to find the true center and then cut it directly in half. So I maximize the amount of fabric I have for my bag. Okay, so now you should have 2 pieces for the outside and the inside of your bag that measure about 14.5 inches by about 22 inches. It might be a little bit smaller, but you're aiming for over 21 inches because we will, after we make our quilt sandwich and do the quilting later, we will trim all this down to the right size. So 14.5-ish by 22-ish inches, 2 pieces. Okay, so then out of the Bosal, you want a matching piece of 14.5 by 22 inches. Basically, you want to cut out the Bosal to be the same size as the 2 pieces of fabric you just cut for the main part of your bag. So now we should have our front and back and a piece of interfacing, foam interfacing for the center. And so these will end up sandwiched around the interfacing, and we will quilt them to make the outside body of our folder. Okay, so I've got my 2 pieces of fabric and my fusible Bosal. And so we're going to basically use the fusible to baste our quilt sandwich together before we go to the sewing machine and add all of our quilting lines. Okay, so that's one side. And now if your print is directional, then you'll want to make sure that you're lining up the inside to match the outside. Mine isn't directional, so I'm not really worrying about it, but just keep that in mind. Perfect. So I'm gonna let this cool down. But our next step is going to be to mark some lines on this for quilting. You also don't have to quilt. You can assemble this bag as is without any quilting. You know, theoretically, this fusible should hold and your, outside and your lining shouldn't separate from the foam. But just for like added detail and kind of because I like the quiltiness and because it helps secure the fabric in place, I am going to quilt all over this to kind of hold everything together like a quilt sandwich. So definitely not a mandatory step, but it's one that I like to do. Okay, so I'm going to mark some cross-hatch quilting lines to quilt my Bosal for the outside of my project folder. And I like these 2 types of marking pins the best. This one is a Sew Line air erase marker that just literally disappears after an hour or so. And then this one is a friction heat erasable pin. And I'm actually going to use this one just because I think it's going to show up better on this fabric. This pin line can be a little bit faint and it disappears kind of quickly. So I want to use the friction one because it'll stay until I iron it off. So I'm going to start with marking my quilt lines. And I'm just going to use one of my quilting rulers that has a 45-degree angle line on it. And so basically I line it up with one of the corners of my little quilt sandwich here. And then I draw a line. Make sure I can see it. And then I'm going to draw lines 1.5 inches away from this line in both directions, and then I'll come back and do the other side. Okay, I've got all of my quilting lines nicely marked, so I'm gonna take this to the sewing machine and let's get it quilted. So I just quilted this whole piece together without the camera on, so great. You're gonna have to imagine what that looked like. But what I was saying was that you should, if you have a walking foot, I would recommend using it because with layers this thick, the walking foot just helps feed everything through the machine more evenly. And so I like to use a walking foot, and then I just like to use pretty much a cream kind of neutral thread for my quilting lines, unless it's on something like super dark or I want like a specialty like colored thread. So I just used cream on top and in the bobbin. And then I used a 3.0 stitch length to do all of the quilting lines. And yeah, I wish I had filmed that for you, but just imagine this whooshing through my machine as I got the quilting lines on. So this is the side where I had the lines drawn, so it looks a little messy. And so you can kind of see what it looks like here on the back with just the quilting lines. So let's take this over to the ironing board and get rid of all of these pin lines that I made earlier. So to clean that up, I just use a hot iron to get rid of all of the pin marks. Hopefully you'll be able to see that on camera. So you can see how much nicer that looks than like right here. So I'm just gonna iron this whole thing and get rid of all those lovely little pin marks. So now this is ready to get turned into the project folder. So let's head back over to the cutting table. Okay, so now that we have our piece, our kind of exterior, interior quilted together, we're gonna trim it to the size we want it to be. So I always recommend cutting the interfacing and the main and lining pieces bigger so that you can trim down later, because quilting can kind of shrink your piece a little tiny bit. So I like to start bigger and then cut down so it's the exact size we want it to be. And so the exact size that we're aiming for is 13.5 inches tall by 22 inches long. So let's see if we can do that here. Okay, so I'm going to cut it to 13.5 first. And I'm just using my ruler and the lines on my mat to cut that straight. And now let's see if we can get 22 inches out of this, or how much we can get. So it looks like we can get about 21.5 inches. So my goal is to shoot for 22. So that way when you fold it, it's about 11 inches into the center. You know, this way, but 21.5 will be totally fine. I just definitely need it to be bigger than 18 inches. And ideally I want it between 20 and 22 inches long. So depending on the kind of width of your fabric off the bolt, most are usually 44 inches, but depending, you know, you might be a little bit smaller, but don't worry about that. It should still come out to about the right size. So I'm gonna cut mine 13.5 inches tall by 21.5 inches long. Okay, so now this is cut to the size I need, which is going to be the finished size of our project folder. So that's the shell of it. So the next step is going to be to sew some lines into the center of our bag. And this is going to kind of create the spine that makes it easier to fold the project folder. And I learned this tip by watching By Annie videos, and she does a lot of really great purse and bag tutorials. And she has talked about how with the foam stabilizer, it really has a good memory if you put some sewing lines in it, and it will just naturally want to fold at those lines. So what I like to do is sew 3 lines in the center, 1 in the dead center and 1.5 inch on either side. And so I'm going to mark those out. So if your quilted piece is exactly 22 inches wide, then you're going to mark a line at 11 inches, and then you're going to mark a line at 10.5 and 10.5 on either side of that center mark. My piece wasn't quite 22 inches, so I'm going to find my center, and then I'm going to mark a 1/2 inch away on either side. So if your piece isn't 22 inches square, find your center and then measure your 1/2 inch. So again, I'm going to use just my friction pen to mark that center line. And then I'm going to mark a 1/2 inch on either side of my center line. So this is how the bag will look when it's closed. This is right side up, bottom. And so if you have a directional print, make sure that your print is facing the direction you want. Mine isn't really directional. Actually, let me just look at it here. Maybe I prefer it like this. So I'm gonna take this over to the machine, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sew down the center line, and I'm gonna sew down the left line. I'm gonna leave the right one alone for now. We'll sew this one down later, but first is just the center and the left. So let's go to the machine. So I'm gonna sew down my center marked line, just the dead center of the bag. And again, I'm just gonna use my walking foot that's still on my machine from quilting, and the same thread combination I've been using for the bag. And I'm gonna lower my stitch length to probably like a 2.4, maybe a 2.2 for this. Just a little tighter than the quilting stitches. I want like just a really tight line of stitches. And now I'm going to pivot and turn this around, and I'm going to sew down this left side of the center line. We don't want to do the right line yet because we're going to sew that down when we add our zippered pocket. On this side though, we need to do the line now. Okay, so now you can see we have our, well actually you might be able to see it a little bit better on the back side of the bag where there's not markings, but we have our center line sewn and the one directly to the left. And on this side, this is going to get our pocket for our chart, and so we're not going to do any top stitching because obviously that would close our pocket, so that's why we're doing that line first, and then our center line, and then when we build our zippered pocket, when we attach the pocket to the bag, that's when we'll do this line of stitching. So this one is just a placement line for now until we actually use it for stitching. Okay, so now we're ready to start building the inside of our bag. And so for the inside, you can see the right side has a clear zippered project bag and then a fabric chart holder, or just a fabric pocket that I like to use to store my chart. You can totally make this pocket out of vinyl as well. That's how I'd originally intended to make the bag, but the problem I had was that the vinyl, I've been using it for the last few months, and the vinyl has been pulling up ink from my chart when I stored my chart in a vinyl pocket. So I decided to switch and do a fabric version. I know people have different preferences over vinyl or fabric, so you can make this bag the exact same way, but substitute a single piece of vinyl for when I'm cutting out these two pocket pieces of fabric. So just keep that in mind if you'd rather have a vinyl pocket on this side. Okay, so let's cut out the fabric for our pocket. Our pocket is going to be all the way up to this stitched line. So let me measure and see exactly how long that is on my bag. It's just a little over, it's like 10 1/4 inches. So I'm gonna cut my accent fabric, which I'm gonna use the hearts, and I'm gonna cut that to 10 1/4 by 13 1/2. And I need 2 of these pieces, one for the outside of the pocket and one for the inside of the pocket. Okay, so we have the 2 pieces of fabric that will become our pocket, and I like to use a piece of interfacing on one of the pieces between the 2 layers to kind of stiffen it up and give the pocket a little bit more stability. And so I'm gonna get my SF101, which is the Pellon I like to use, but really you can kind of use any light to mid-weight fusible interfacing. You could even probably use like a thin fusible fleece, whatever you have on hand. I'm just gonna use the SF101 that I have on hand. And I'm gonna cut the piece out exactly to match the size of the pocket I just cut. So whatever size your pocket is, it should be 13 1/2 inches tall by a 1/2 inch less than half the width of your bag, if that makes sense. The way I kind of designed this is so that the pockets go up to about 1 inch. They meet about 1 inch away in the center, and that gives you room to kind of fold it over and have a little bit of, you know, bulk in there. So that way you can like load it up with your things. So now we have our pocket, and then we'll fuse a piece of interfacing to one side, and we'll layer this side on it, and that is going to create our pocket. But we also need, as you may have seen in the other bag that I showed you, I like to add the binding and the accent fabric to the pocket as well. So let's go ahead and, while we're sitting at the cutting table, get all of our binding and accent pieces cut out. I'm going to be using this navy to go with my print. So from our binding strips, we're going to need a few things. We're going to need the binding that goes all the way around the outside of our bag. And then we're going to need 2 strips for the top and bottom of our zipper and 1 strip for the top of our fabric pocket or our vinyl pocket. This could be fabric or vinyl. So I'm going to just cut all the strips out at once, and yeah, then we'll start assembling our pockets. Oh, the last thing I forgot to mention, we will also need the strips to create our little magnetic tab closure. So we'll cut that out now too. Okay, so I'm going to cut 3 2-inch strips. And then with the remaining fabric, I'm going to cut 4 2¼ inch strips for binding. I like to use 2¼ inch for binding bags because I like a little bit of smaller binding. If you're more comfortable with 2½ inches, feel free to adjust the measurements, but I'm going to cut 4 2¼ inch strips for my binding. Okay, so with our binding strips that we cut out, our 2-inch strips, let's cut these down into the sizes that we need them to be. And what we need is 3 pieces that are 2 inches by 13½ inches. So I'm gonna cut that now. Okay, so those are our 3 strips for our binding for our pockets. And then we need 2 pieces that are gonna make the magnetic closure. And so out of 2 of my leftover pieces of binding strips, I am going to cut out a 2-inch by 6-inch piece. Okay, so those are the binding strips we need. Okay, so last thing we need to cut while we're sitting at the table is our vinyl. So the bag will have, as I showed you, the vinyl zipper pocket on one side and our fabric pocket on the other. So now that we have all of our kind of bindings and facings cut out, I just need to cut out the vinyl piece for the side of the bag. So for the vinyl, I'm gonna cut my piece 9 inches wide by 13½ inches long. The 9-inch length may end up being slightly longer than what we need, and we may cut it down, but I'm gonna start with 9 inches and then we will trim it later if it needs to be trimmed. And so you can see this vinyl comes with this nice paper on the back that makes it easier to see while you're cutting things out. And then you can use it on your machine to help you when you're sewing the vinyl later. And so I have, you know, the kind of height I need. And so I'm going to trim down the width to 13½ inches, which is as wide as our finished bag. Okay, and so that's the piece of vinyl. So let's go over to the ironing board and we're gonna prep all of our little bindings so that we can make our pockets. Okay, first thing we're gonna do is attach our fusible interfacing to the back of one of our pieces of our pocket. And so I'm gonna set that aside. Just using a little bit of water to press this really nice and flat before I fuse my interfacing to it. Okay, so this is just my piece of fabric for the inside of the pocket, and then my fabric for the outside of the pocket with the fusible on it. And I'm just gonna layer these together and flip it over actually. And so I'm just gonna iron these together. This piece is not gonna be stuck on here, not until we add our binding, but I'm just gonna kind of press these pieces together so they stay in place until we need to add the binding. Okay, so this is our chart pocket ready for binding. So with our 3 pieces of 2-inch by 13½, we're gonna press these all 3 the exact same way. So first we're gonna start by pressing them in half. And then we're gonna open them back up and we're gonna press our edges towards the center. So I don't go all the way to the center. I leave maybe like 1/8 of an inch kind of showing there. And so I do that on both sides, and then we'll end up closing it again. So let me press these sides into the center. Okay, and so then once both sides are pressed, I fold it in half. Ooh, careful not to burn the tips of your fingers. Give it a second to cool off. I give it a really, really good press in half. And then I move this back here and I lay my clapper on it, and the clapper just helps it cool and that it helps it kind of stay crisply folded. So I just lay my clapper on it while I work on the next strip. And so I'm just going to do that to all 3 of my binding strips. Okay, so I got this binding made. I'm gonna leave the the magnetic snap little tab. I'm gonna leave this off to the side for now. We're gonna go to the sewing machine and do a few of the next steps before we work on that magnetic tab. Okay, so before we start attaching any pockets to the inside of our bag, we first need to attach 1/2 of our magnetic snap. So our magnetic snap, half of it's gonna go on the front of the bag under a little patch here, and the other half will go in our little kind of closure flap that attaches to the back of the bag. And so we need to put this magnet in place before we're able to attach the fabric kind of chart pocket, because otherwise, you know, we'll sew it straight through the pocket and then you won't be able to get a chart in there, you know, a whole thing. So what we need to do is identify what the front side of our bag is. So when the bag is closed, which way is the front, top and bottom, you know, kind of make a decision on which side you like the best. And so for me, this is my front, this is my top, this is the bottom. And so I want to mark the spot where my magnet is going to sit on the front. So I have that when I go to the sewing machine. So let's mark that. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my mat and I'm going to come about 1.5 inches away from this edge. So our binding is going to cover about 1/2 inch. And then I want my magnet, you know, about 1/2 to 1 inch away from the binding on the front. And so I'm going to come about 1.5 inches away, and I'm going to find the center point of the length of my bag. And so I know my bag is about 13, or is exactly 13.5 inches tall. So for me, that's going to be 6 3/4 inches. That's going to be my halfway point. And so I'm going to use my friction pin, and I'm just going to mark at the 6 3/4 inch mark a little dot, so I know that's where my center point is. And then using this little small ruler here, what I'm gonna do is use that little center mark, and I'm gonna line it up with kind of the 1/2 inch mark of my ruler. And I'm basically just trying to draw a little 1 inch square right where that box is, because I want this to be kind of centered, you know, in my bag. So I'm gonna draw 2 sides of the square here. I'm gonna flip it so you can kind of see that right there. And then draw here. So now you can see I have a square centered top to bottom about 1 inch away from where my binding's going to be. And so that's where I want my magnetic snap to end up. So these are guidelines for when I go to the sewing machine. So to create the little patch that covers our magnet, I'm going to use leftovers of my 2-inch strip that I cut out earlier. And I'm going to cut a 2-inch square. Okay, and so we're gonna go back to the ironing board to create our patch, but basically we're gonna end up just, you know, ironing and folding this into a little, you know, no raw edges patch, and that's what's gonna encase our magnet on the front of our bag. So let's take this over to the ironing board and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so with our little 2-inch square, we're just trying to make it just bigger than this little plastic magnet case. And this is just slightly bigger than 1 inch. And so if I fold it in 1/2 inch, I would end up with a 1 inch square. If I did a 1/4 inch, I'd end up with an 1.5 inch square. So what I'm aiming for is kind of a 3/8 of an inch fold. And I'm doing this to cover all of my raw edges. So I'm just going to iron down, and I'm going to let it really, really get hot and flat. And I'll kind of let it sit under the clapper for a second between presses, because I'm really trying to get this nice and flat. And then I'm just going to rotate a 1/4 turn and press 3/8 inch fold. Okay, so I've got all 4 sides ironed, so I'm just going to let this sit underneath my clapper for just a few minutes to cool down and really keep its shape, and then we'll attach one of the sides of our magnet to our bag. Okay, so here is our little patch that we made over at the ironing board, and I'm just going to trim any loose threads from it. And basically, we're going to take one of the sides of our magnet, pull it apart, and one of these is going to get sewn down right underneath this patch on that little square that we drew. And so in order to help everything stay together while I sew, what I do is I use a little bit of Aleene's tacky glue, and basically I just use a little light coating on the back of my magnet, kind of on this plastic that I'm going to be sewing through. It really doesn't do anything to my needle. I do change my needle, you know, pretty often, but I don't really have a problem sewing through a little light layer of glue, but kind of test this out with your own machine. This one works for mine. And then I put a dollop underneath the magnet, and I set it down and center it right on that little patch that I just made. And so that just helps keep the magnet in place on that patch when we go to sew it down to the front of our bag. And so I'm just going to make sure all my little edges are nice and tucked under. I want this to look nice and pretty, you know, from this front side. And so then what we're going to do is center it on our project bag and sew it down. If you don't like the look of this decorative patch, one thing you could do to kind of hide the magnet is to sew the magnet from the underneath of your bag. And so you would just have a stitching line showing on the front, and your magnet would be buried underneath the fabric pocket. The only reason why I don't do that and kind of prefer to put it on the front of the bag using the little, you know, decorative patch is because the magnets I use are slightly raised. And so the magnets are supposed to close flat side together. There's like a flat side and a raised side. And so if I sewed it on the underneath, the raised side would be inside the pocket. And so when sliding charts in, I felt like my charts would get hung up on the magnet. And so that's why I chose to sew my magnet to the front of the bag. But, you know, feel free to customize this as you like. So now that I have the glue dry on the magnet and the patch, I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the magnet and glue it right down into the spot that I drew, like kind of my guidelines that I drew. And so that's just going to kind of help the magnet stay in place as I sew around all of the edges. And so I'm just going to top stitch about 1/8 of an inch away. I'm going to use a 2.0 stitch length, and just make sure you don't run into the magnet, obviously, with your needle, because it will break, but there's plenty of room around the outside of this to sew it in place. Oh, and one thing to keep in mind is this, if your sewing machine is like most and has this metal plate, your magnet will kind of be attracted to it. It's easy, it's, you know, like the feed dogs will help you feed everything through, but if you feel something kind of pulling, it's probably the magnet trying to magnetize itself to your sewing machine. So just keep that in mind as you're sewing. Okay, And then there you can see on the front, that's where 1/2 of our magnetic closure is, and then we'll make a little tab to fold over onto it in a minute. And then on the inside of the bag, it's just a little square, and this will be covered by that fabric pocket, and our charts and anything we want to slide in there will slide nicely. It won't get hung up on any closures. So that's how I attach half the magnet. Okay, let's work on our pockets. I've got the fabric chart pocket right here, and I have my one of my pieces of binding, and that is going to go across the top of the pocket to secure both layers together and give a nice decorative finish. So I'm just going to lay my fabric inside that binding, fold it over, and I'm going to use some clips to hold it in place while I sew. And so I just kind of lay my pocket in there all the way up into that center fold, and then fold the binding down and clip into place. So again, I'm just going to use a 2.0 stitch length, and I'm going to top stitch my binding on 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. Okay, so that is our chart pocket made with the binding on the top. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to base this into the bag to hold it in place. So I put my chart pocket on the left side of the bag when it's open. And so basically we want the top edge of our binding to go right to that stitch line that we made before for the spine of our bag. And so I'm going to line everything up. And then I'm going to clip some things in place here. And then just starting up in the top right corner, I'm just going to do a basting stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the outside all the way around, and that will just hold our pocket in place for when we get to binding, which will fully lock everything into place. Okay, so that is the fabric pocket side done. So let's build our vinyl pocket for this side. I have the piece of vinyl that we cut earlier. And so the first thing I'm gonna do is apply binding to the top edge of our vinyl. And so I'm gonna leave the paper on, but I'm gonna trim a little bit of it away because obviously I don't wanna sew through the paper. I just like it there to help it kind of glide through my machine a little easier. So I'm going to roll this paper back. Okay. And so I'm going to do the same thing as I just did, where I'm going to fold the binding around the top edge of my vinyl and pin it or clip it into place. Okay, so we have the top edge of our vinyl with its binding on, and so now we need to grab the zipper. And so basically what we're going to be doing is attaching our zipper to the top edge of the vinyl here, and then we'll add another piece of binding on the top edge of the zipper to finish it off. I'm going to switch over to my zipper foot. So I recommend working with a 16-inch or bigger zipper, but the only zipper I had that was the right color is this 14-inch zipper, which will work. It's just going to be a little bit tight between, like, basically I want to be able to cut off the metal zipper end and top, because I don't like having those in my binding. It makes it hard, like physically, like you can kind of feel like those metal zips. So what I'm going to try and do is attach my vinyl right basically inside of the metal zipper pull so I can cut them off later. And so with a 16-inch or larger zipper, obviously you don't have to worry about it being as tight. So you can make this bag with a 14-inch zipper. I just think a 16-inch is easier, but I am working with what I have in my stash. And so basically what I'm doing is laying this binding that I just sewed to the vinyl about, you know, a 1/4 of an inch away from the zipper teeth. And I'm just going to top stitch with my zipper foot that binding into place on the zipper. And so I'm just going to make sure that everything stays nice and even as I sew. If you prefer, you can use like a sewing glue stick and glue your zipper into place before sewing it together, which might make it a little bit easier. I just kind of am used to working with zippers, and I just prefer to sit down and kind of eyeball it. So, you know, do what you prefer. Okay, so you can see we have our zipper now sewn down to our vinyl. And so now we need to add the final piece of binding to the top of the zipper, and that will complete the vinyl pocket side. So just the same as we've done before, we're just going to attach our binding to the zipper. Now, the only thing that's different about attaching the binding to the zipper is that we don't want to go all the way into the fold, because you can see that we would be sewing right on top of the zipper teeth. And so we want to match, you know, kind of halfway away from the zipper like we did on the other side. And so again, we are going to have just a little bit more room. You know, this fold is not going to go all the way up against the zipper. So if you want to glue or pin this in place before you sew, definitely go for it. I just tend to kind of eyeball it. But you know, I have been sewing these for a long time, so I would probably recommend pinning or gluing your zipper in place before attempting this step. Okay, so that is what our zipper pocket side looks like with its binding on. And so we're going to do the same thing we just did to our fabric pocket, which is to baste it onto the bag so it's ready for binding. But first, let me grab my scissors and trim off the ends of these zippers. Okay, and so for basting your bag, you might remember earlier we had drawn these 3 lines and we hadn't stitched one of them. And so that line, the other 1/2 inch line that we drew, is going to be where we line up our zipper bag binding. And then we're actually going to top stitch where we would have sewn that line. And that'll kind of create the spine of our bag. So I want to line that up for when I baste the bag together. So first thing I'm going to do is top stitch the binding down to the bag, and then I will baste around the 3 vinyl edges just to hold them in place until we get to the overall bag binding. And so I'm going to baste just 1/8 of an inch away from my binding, hoping to land it kind of right on that line that I drew in the previous step. So I went across the bag, and now I am just going to baste around the whole outside of the bag to hold everything in place. And if you notice down here, my binding is a little bit long. I mean, it's not my binding, my vinyl is a little bit long, and I'll trim this off before I bind the final bag together. That's why I was saying, don't worry if your vinyl or even your pocket. I think over here, my pocket ended up being a little bit long too. So we'll just trim that off in a minute. So now we basically have our bag, our folder made with our pockets. We just need to add all of the outside binding and our little closure flap. So, woohoo, almost there. Okay, I'm gonna trim everything up so my little quilt sandwich of a bag is all nice and square and easy to bind. So our bag is all trimmed up and ready for us to attach our binding to close it. And so now you can see we have our 3 little seam lines on the bag, which act as the spine of our bag. And you can see how that kind of helps it close, you know, nicely where it's supposed to. So yay. Okay, so let's talk about the little tab for the closure. And that's what we cut these 2 2-inch by 6-inch strips for earlier. So the other thing we need to get this tab ready is some interfacing. And so I'm going to cut out some more of my SF101. You could use fusible fleece or something a little thicker for this purpose, but basically what I'm trying to do is give the tab a little bit of stability because it's going to be, you know, opened and closed a lot. And even though the magnet is super easy to open, you're going to be tugging on it a lot. So I want it to have some stability. So I'm going to interface both sides of the tab before we sew it together. Okay, so I'm going to take these to the ironing board real quick and just fuse my interfacing onto both pieces of the tab. And then we're going to go back to the sewing machine to finish assembling our bag. Okay, so with our 2 little tabs, we are going to finish making the closure for our bag. So we need the other half of our magnet, and we're going to sew the magnet to the underside of our tab. So if for some reason you're using 2 different fabrics, you want the magnet sewn on to the piece that's going to be under, you know, the tab. So it will be kind of wrong side in, I guess. I'm using the same fabric, so it doesn't matter which side I attach this magnet to. Basically what you want is about a 1/2 inch margin from the edge of the magnet plastic to the top of your fabric and then to the sides. And so we're going to sew it on just like this. And we want the flat side of the magnet. Again, I talked about the flat versus the raised sides. We want the flat side down on the wrong side of the fabric. And that will mean that when it goes to close, our, you know, flat sides are meeting right there on the magnet. And that's how this magnet works best. So I'm going to actually use a little bit of glue like I did before. And I'm just going to put it underneath the magnet. I don't really need to put it on the plastic, so I don't even have to sew through it this time. I'm just putting it on the magnet to hold it in place on the fabric. And so then I'll just position that just where I want it. And I'm going to let that glue set for a second. And then I'm going to sew a straight line kind of square all around the plastic like I did on this one. So you're going to notice that it's going to stick to your plate of your machine. Before we had the foam in the way, so it was a little less magnety, a little less sticky, but it really will stick to your machine. But your feed dogs should pull it through no problem. Just kind of keep that in mind as you work, that it, you know, is going to want to kind of stick to your machine. So I'm actually going to switch back over to my zipper foot to sew this one on. If you don't want to deal with the magnet, like in working with the magnet, it can be a little fiddly, but I really like the look of it. But if you don't want to deal with it, you can use sewn in Velcro in place of what I'm doing here. So you could sew on Velcro to the front and sew in Velcro to your tab, and then just have a Velcro closure. Velcro is definitely easier to work with. I just really like the look and feel of using this magnet closure. And so that's why I deal with, you know, the fiddliness of sewing around a magnet on a sewing machine made out of metal. You can see even my scissors want to stick to it. So now we have one of our zipper tabs with the magnet sewn in place. And then we're gonna take our other tab and we're gonna sew these right sides together along 3 sides. So we're gonna leave this bottom edge open for turning. And so we're gonna sew down 3 sides. And I'm just using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So here's our little tab, and now we need to turn it inside out and press it and top stitch it. So let me get this turned inside out. There's a number of different types of tools for turning tubes. I tend to just use my fingers or a little crochet hook to help me push out the tube, but it's a little small one. It's not too bad to do. Okay, so it can get a little tough at the end because you're trying to pull the part with the magnet up through. So just be patient with it and kind of wiggle it up through the end and kind of use a crochet hook or a turning tool to kind of help you get that all the way out. And I'll use my crochet hook to work my corners out. There we go. So I'm going to take this to the ironing board real quick, and I'm just going to press it nice and flat. Actually, I'm going to work on that corner one more time. So I'm going to take it to the ironing board and I'm going to press it nice and flat, and then we're going to top stitch it to finish it off. Okay, so here it is all nice and pressed. So you can see this is where the magnet is sewn in on the underneath. And then here is what the kind of top side or pretty side looks like. And so I'm just going to add a top stitch 1/8 of a way from the edge. Okay, so that is what our little tab looks like that will close our bag. Yeah, so I think we're ready to attach our binding and get our bag all sewn up. So if I sew the closure on like this, you can see there's kind of a lot of extra room. And so I'm going to trim it down a little first because I don't feel like my bag needs to be this thick. So I'm going to take 3/4 of an inch off the length. But basically how you can kind of play around with it is put it, you know, on the other half of its magnet, fold the bag in half, and then you kind of fold it around. And with the tab, it's going to get sewn into the binding, and so you kind of roll it over so that the edge is right up against the edge of the bag, and just kind of take a 1/2 inch and assume that a 1/2 inch is going to be sewn into the binding. And so then you can kind of see that we're left with a pretty big tab. So I think I'm going to take about 3/4 of an inch off of this, so it's a little bit smaller of a tab. Okay, so my tab ended up finishing at 5 inches long. So I would recommend, you can test out a couple different sizes, but I would say 5 inches works pretty well for the tab length. Okay, so I'm gonna baste the closure tab onto the bag before binding, so it just is in place, so we don't have to worry about it later. And so I'm gonna let the magnetic snap kind of come together, and I'm gonna make sure the edges of my bag are nice and lined up and everything is nice and centered. And I'm gonna flip it over to the back side. And then I'm just gonna use my little friction pin to mark 2 little lines. And so I know that basically I wanna sew my tab on right between those lines so it'll be nice and lined up. So to sew your tab on, you want the magnet side facing up and the pretty side facing down. So that way when you wrap around the bag, the pretty side will be down on the front of your bag. So I'm gonna baste that into place. And so then the closure will end up wrapping around to the front, and the binding will hold everything down and in place. Okay, so I'm gonna get my binding made really quickly. This is my 2 1/4 inch binding strips, and I am gonna sew them together on the bias and get my binding made, and then we'll talk about attaching it. I use the Cluck Cluck Sew diagonal seam tape to line up my binding pieces. That way I don't have to mark anything. I can just line them up and start sewing. going to take all of this binding to the ironing board, press my seams open and fold it in half, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I have my binding, my 2 1/4 inch binding, pressed in half, and I'm going to attach it to my project folder to finish it off. And so the way I like to attach my binding on these bags is to sew the binding down using a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the inside of the bag, and then I wrap it around to the front of the bag to top stitch it down. So I'm going to switch to my 1/4 inch foot, and I'm going to sew this binding in place. Okay, so where I'm going to start with the binding, this is the front of the bag. So I would prefer to start my binding on the back of the bag, which would be the vinyl pocket side. But since this is vinyl, when we attach the binding, you kind of have to fold, and I don't really want to fold and attach on the vinyl. So I'm going to start my end-to-end my binding on the bottom of the front page. So when I get to a corner, I like to stop a 1/4 inch away from the edge, and then I pivot and I put the corner kind of coming straight down this center red line of my seam tape and sew a 45-degree angle off the corner. And I go ahead and pull it off the machine and turn my bag. And then I pull the binding straight up and create a 45-degree fold in the corner, and then fold it straight back down so that that top fold is even with the top of my edge. And then I start sewing from the corner and sew straight down the next side. As we get close to where our tab is attached, I'm just watching to make sure that it's laying nice and flat, because basically we're going to be sewing over the tab with while we're attaching the binding. So I want to make sure it's laying exactly where it needs to be when I sew over it. Okay, and so then I'm going to leave myself about 5 to 6 inches of space to do the joining of my binding. Okay, let's flip around over to my table and talk about joining this binding. Okay, so I am going to join my binding together on the bias, and so to do that, I need to lay out my pieces of binding and make sure they overlap the same size as the width of my binding. So I need a 2 1/4 inch overlap. And so I'm going to use my board here to kind of help me. And I'm going to figure out, let's see, I think this is about 5 inches. So I want my binding to attach about right here. Okay, so with that little center line that I marked, I'm actually gonna line up my ruler, and half of 2 1/4 is 1 1/8. So I'm gonna lay the 1 1/8 inch mark down where that little line is that I drew, and I'm going to trim my fabric. Actually, I'm just gonna draw on it first and then I'll trim it, so I know. And so I'm going to trim my fabric right here. And then I'm going to lay this piece on top of it. And so I want there to be a 2 1/4 inch overlap. So I'm going to measure 2 1/4 inches onto this piece and then trim it. Okay, so now I'm ready to sew these together on the bias and finish off the binding. So to join them, I am going to pull this piece of binding down like this, And I'm gonna fold the bag to make it a little easier to work with. Hopefully we can still see this on camera. And I'm gonna lay the top piece down at a 90-degree angle. And let me give it a pin and I'll show you. I'm sure it's hidden right now. But basically you're laying your pieces down on a 90-degree angle so we can sew a bias seam. And we're actually gonna sew from this corner to this corner. Let me take over the sewing machine and it might be a little easier to see what I'm doing. I think I should have left myself a little bit more room. So let me seam rip just a little bit here. Okay, that should make it a little bit easier to sew together. But basically, I'm just sewing from corner to corner to create that bias join. I definitely prefer to do a straight join. It is much less fiddly than what I'm dealing with right this second. But I think the bias looks nicer, and since this is going to go on the front of my bag, I'm going to use this bias join. And so I'm just going to keep my point down here on that red line and try and sew as straight a line as possible. Okay, then we take our pins out and make sure everything is sewn the way we want and it's the right length, it looks like it. So I'm going to trim off this excess fabric. And then I'm just going to finger press open this little seam that I just sewed, and then press in half and make sure it lies nicely on the bag, which it does. And then I'm going to finish sewing it down to the back of the bag, or to the inside of the bag rather. Okay, so now we have the binding all the way around our bag, and now we need to fold it around to the front and top stitch it into place. So now that I am top stitching, this vinyl is going to be face down on my machine, and it might kind of not slide as nice. It might kind of get stuck while I'm sewing. And so if that starts happening, I have the piece of paper that was on my vinyl that I can lay underneath here to help everything kind of slide through the machine. So you can use this, tissue paper. They make non-stick mats for your machine. There's all kinds of different ways to work with vinyl, but I tend to just use the paper that comes on that by Annie roll. And so I am just going to fold my binding with my fingers around to the front of the bag, and I'm just making sure that the edge of the binding comes across that stitching line that we just sewed. That was from sewing the binding on to the inside of the bag. Oh, also in the corners that have the vinyl, I do like to trim, just kind of blunt the corner a little bit right there, and that just helps when I'm wrapping my fabric around for binding to have just a little bit less bulk. So I'll do that before I get started. So I'm going to slide this piece of paper underneath the vinyl, and I'm not going all the way up to the edge of the binding because I don't want to accidentally sew it in place. I'm just laying it kind of underneath the vinyl to give me a little bit slippier of a surface to feed under my machine. Okay, so I also find having a stiletto tool, or you can use your seam ripper, really helpful to kind of guide yourself around the binding and hold things in place. That way your finger doesn't have to be right up underneath the needle. So I'll be using this by Annie stiletto tool, and you just saw me clipping everything into place. So I use some clips around in certain places, and mostly just to get me started and around the corners. And my goal with attaching, like top stitching the binding, is to stitch on the very edge of the binding, just on the outside of the previous seam I sewed, so that the lining of the binding kind of lines right up next to the binding on the back. So that is the goal. And as I get to the corner, having a stiletto or using a seam ripper is really useful to hold the fabric together at the points where they meet. And then once I have my needle in the spot where kind of both the fabrics meet, I do a little pivot and I sew a couple of stitches straight up into the corner to kind of secure the corners. And then I reverse back and pivot. I'm going to adjust my little paper under my vinyl. So we're back around to where we started, so I'm just going to cross over where I started and backstitch a couple stitches. And now we have our binding attached. So let me trim up and clean up some loose threads here. So this is kind of what your corners and your binding should look like. A nice 45-degree angle into the corner, top stitched about 1/8 of an inch away. And then on the inside of the bag, you'll see that the binding top stitch is kind of right inside where we sewed our binding on, or maybe it went a little inside of it. It's totally fine. But the key and the kind of trick to binding is just to go super slow and be super precise with what you're doing and kind of not let things shift around on you as you sew. But yeah, it just really takes practice. So I think it turned out super nice, and we have our little magnetic closure. Oh my gosh, so cute. So I think we're done with our bag. So that's our bag. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I will respond just as soon as I can. You can also email me at the email address listed below if that's easier. And yeah, I look forward to seeing all the project folders that you guys create with this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.